Over the past 5 months, pro-democracy demonstrators have taken place throughout Thailand and on the streets of Bangkok. The demonstrations aim to topple the government of Prayut Chan-o-cha and the military-backed Senate. The protesters say that the current constitution, which was drafted by the military, is flawed because it contains provisions for an all-appointed Senate and allows the Senate to choose the Prime Minister. At times, the demonstrations have touched upon issues which are taboo in Thai society, including issues related to the royal institution and the role that its extended networks play within the country's governance. To truly understand the demonstrations, one has to look back at the recent history of Thailand and what has led to this moment. In 2013 and 2014, the democratically elected government of Yingluck Shinawatra was under pressure from anti-government demonstrations. The demonstrations alleged that her government was corrupt and stole money from the people. During these protests, the protest leaders called for an unelected government that would oversee the country's transition from the corrupt Yingluck government to a new democratically elected government. The demands from the protesters suggested a cabinet that was appointed either by the court or by themselves, and not through the election process, which they said was flawed and undermined by the Yingluck government. These protests lasted for months, until eventually it culminated in a military coup led by General Prayut Chan-o-cha and General Prawit Wongsuwon. They took power in May of 2014, and after doing so, outlawed and banned and arrested any opposition. Those protesting their rules were jailed or fined, politicians were banned, gatherings of political natures were banned, and martial law was implemented. Prayut and Prawit promised that the country would return to democracy within a year, but those promises fell short. Instead, they ruled for the next 5 years with an iron fist, installing the current constitution, which was drafted by military members, a constitution that protesters now say is flawed. In 2019, after 5 years of military rule, there was finally an election, contested by numerous parties, including a new party called Future Forward, one that represented the progressive voice of Thai society, and one which was opposed to military intervention into politics. Future Forward and its progressive policies grated on conservative Thai society, and eventually in February of 2020, they were dissolved by the Constitutional Court on a technicality. Their leader, Thanathorn, was banned. Their executive council was also banned from politics. The dissolution of Future Forward led to widespread protests by students who had voted the party in. These protests were eventually stopped with the outbreak of COVID, and everything was shelved as the country went into lockdown. As local transmissions in Thailand ceased, the protests flared back up again in June. But with the government unwilling to listen, the protesters began increasing their demands. Instead of just replacing the constitution and the Prayut government, these protests, while not initially touching on the royal institution, eventually grew in demand and scope because the government failed to listen and heed the warnings of the protesters. Since then, there have been clashes between government and pro-democracy forces at regular intervals, with mass protests and arrests following suit. Complicating the matter is the arrival of the royalist yellow shirts, who argue that these pro-democracy demonstrators wanted to topple the country's monarchy. The yellow shirts have also mobilized, and this has led to several clashes between yellow shirt protesters and pro-democracy protesters. With the government unwilling to resign, the country is now at an impasse and no solution seems viable in the near future.